All right, there you go. And so it went. Of course, we're seeing this in Charlottesville, Virginia, very much ground zero. Here at home in our country, there are names like Cornwallis and Langevin, Ryerson, and the list goes on, who for some are symbolic of racism and colonialism, hatred and violence. These were some of Canada's founding fathers, and there are those who want those monuments and statues to be removed. So we see this going on really on both sides of the border. To dig a little deeper in what's at stake here and also what happened in Charlottesville and what's going on in the U.S., we're joined by a number of voices here. We've got Avis Jones-Deweever, who is a well-known political and social commentator, joining us from Virginia. We've also got Barbara Perry. She is a global hate crime expert as well. Good to have both of the two of you with us today. And if I can start with you, Avis, you heard what Donald Trump just said. Where does it end? George Washington had slaves. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Are they next? What did you make of that? And what do you think the president was trying to say?
Hopefully it ends with him out of the White House. Clearly, what we have here, if anyone needed any more evidence, we definitely have it here. We have an apologist, we have a racist, we have a white supremacist who's occupying the Oval Office of the United States. He's also someone who has a very tenuous understanding and grasp of history. If he really understood history, he would know that he is supposed to be the president of the United States. And the people that he was protecting with his words are actually traitors and revolutionaries to the president of the United States and to his country as a whole. And if they would have won their war, not only would I be in chains, he would not be president of this nation because we would not have this nation. He is ignorant, he is racist, and he is not worthy of the office.
Barbara, I want to get your read, too, on what we heard and whether you think Donald Trump was, in some ways, because he talked about, there were people on both sides, troublemakers on both sides, and he was immediately called out by someone in the media who said, wait a minute, are you trying to equate the folks who were on the left with these white nationalists and these neo-Nazi groups? And he said, no, I'm not trying to equate them. I'm simply saying, there were troublemakers out for violence on both sides. What do you make of what he said?
I was struck by that comment, but also some of his other rhetoric that sounded so much like what you hear from some of the white nationalists. So, as Avis was saying, sort of an apologist for the far right, but in particular with respect to what he was saying about, folks on both sides being responsible. We didn't see them coming on Friday night, ready to armed as the far right activists were. We didn't see them coming there ready to go on the offensive. Rather, they were on the defensive, and I think it's disingenuous to frame them in any other way.
When we talk about some of these symbols of history, Avis, getting back to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, I mean, these men are on the currency. There are statues to them all over the place. I mean, is it time to start thinking about them, or is that different than Robert E. Lee?
I think that it's time to really start thinking globally about our history and how it's represented and misrepresented in this nation, and quite frankly around the world when it comes to white imperialism and oppression. But specifically as it relates to Robert E. Lee, I mean, that is a particularly disturbing symbol to me personally as someone who is a native of Virginia. And also I think it's important to note that when we talk about these issues, we need to understand the proliferation of these statues across this nation. In America, there are nearly 2,000 of these different statues or other sorts of ways in which Confederate soldiers have been memorialized throughout this nation, whether it be via statues, whether it be via the names on schools, whether it be even military bases named after Confederate soldiers. It is absolutely an affront to this nation to honor traitors in this way. I am not familiar with any other nation in the world that goes to this extent to honor people who actually revolted against them.
Barbara, I want to get your read on what we're looking at as well north of the border here, because there are controversial statues and buildings named after controversial historical figures. We know even in Halifax in Nova Scotia, We have the former military governor of Halifax, British Edward Cornwallis. There is a statue to him in Halifax. This is a man who waged biological warfare on Aboriginals back in the day when he was first in charge of Halifax at the time. We know there have already been protests by those who want the statue taken down. They say it is offensive and inappropriate. They want it covered up, and we're seeing this conversation happening right across Canada now as well, and we're seeing it covered up here in some of this footage. What do you make of that sort of issue? Whether that is erasing Canada's past, as some have said, or whether that is being more sensitive to highly controversial figures?
I think it's interesting that just as the far right has mobilized more of the far right up here, that anti-racists have also mobilized Canadians to stand up in much the same way and to challenge these sorts of emblems and symbols of colonialism and racism in our country. So I think it's really important that we continue to challenge those sorts of symbols. One of the interesting things that I'm seeing in the American context is some communities have taken these statues in particular off of public parks, out of public parks, those sorts of venues, and put them in places, whether museums or schools, that contextualize them. They provide a history, they provide a story that ties and explains why is Robert E. Lee offensive to so many people? Why is Cornwallis offensive to so many people? And I think that that's a really important message and maybe a way to remember history very differently. We're not erasing it. We're simply, I think, bringing to the surface a lot of the history that's forgotten and has, in fact, probably been silenced over the years.
Avis, when you see footage of people or, these protest groups toppling these statues, as we're seeing now, in the case of different Confederate figures going on in your country, is that the answer, or does that then trigger a backlash where some people then feel that they are personally offended by that statue being literally toppled down by, in their mind, basically mob violence?
Yeah, I certainly understand how it can be interpreted that way, and I would prefer to see that these statues were, laterally removed, and I think it's perfectly fine to put them in a museum in a context like that, where they could be relegated to the realms of history where they belong and not someplace in the public square. But quite frankly, I can understand the outrage and the frustration that has led to that type of reaction. People have been pushing for decades to get these things removed, things that, quite frankly, weren't even put in place until there was some movement in this country in terms of expanding Black progress. They were put in place as a reactionary item, just as the Confederate flag that we now know really did not sort of reemerge after the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement, really as a hate symbol. So if we understood the history behind why these things were put in place in the first place, they haven't been here all along. They were put in place specifically to intimidate, to spread hate. And until we sort of get that and understand why there's such a huge, vehement movement against it, we're not going to be able to make the progress that we need in order to ultimately bring people together.
Barbara, I'm also curious what your take is on sort of the role of leaders here, like President Donald Trump, to sort of be aware of the extremely sensitive nature of race in the United States. And these things happen in countries around the world, Canada no exception, but particularly in the U.S. because of its dark history and the Civil War. When he sort of downplays it or seems perhaps not to have as much knowledge as other presidents have had about that, I mean, is that fair assessment, do you think, or is he simply trying to bridge the divide?
Oh, by no means is he trying to bridge any divides. You talk about awareness. I think he's very much aware of the impact of his messaging. I think he's very much aware of the state of race relations and the damage that these sorts of demonstrations have done. He continues to play to that basest of sentiment, I think, in many respects. He's not going to bring the country together in any way with this kind of rhetoric. He further creates tension and conflict. It's as Avis said at the beginning, it's just sort of a despicable and vile way for a national leader to behave, to take sides as he has done, essentially.
Yeah, one last thing, Avis, just quickly for you. I mean, is there any sense that perhaps Donald Trump is just not aware of his history, and that's why he's saying some of these things?
Well, that's certainly a possibility. He doesn't seem to be the most, quite frankly, educated man on matters of substance, to be perfectly honest. But, it doesn't really take a huge level of education. It takes a heart. It takes compassion. It takes humanity. It takes morality. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that he lacks all of those qualities as well.
Great to have both of you with us today, Barbara and Avis. Thank you for your time.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much.